Chapter 1. A Trifle Disturbed. It was on a quiet afternoon, in a house priding itself on precision and polish, that Hercule Poirot was summoned to consider a disappearance of the most delicate kind. The residence in question stood in one of those serene London squares where the hedges are clipped as though by mathematical instrument and the brass knockers gleam with a moral determination to reflect the sun. Within, everything suggested order not merely as a preference, but as a creed. Cushions lay at symmetrical angles. Curtains fell in obedient folds. Even the fire, though lively, seemed to burn with decorum. The lady of the house, Mrs. Adela Penbury, received Poirot in a drawing-room whose pale green walls and restrained gilt frames betrayed a temperament inclined toward moderation. She herself was composed, her dark hair drawn back smoothly, her voice calm though faintly edged. "It is such a small matter, Monsieur Poirot," she began, then checked herself with a faint smile. "You must forgive me. I am told you prefer to be addressed simply as Mr. Poirot." "That is quite sufficient, madam," he replied gently. "Pray continue. The small matters are often those of the greatest interest." She inclined her head. "It was after tea yesterday. We had guests, only a few intimate friends. My sister, Margaret Ashcombe, has been staying with me these past weeks. She has not been in robust health, but nothing of significance. We took tea at 4, as is our custom." Her hand gestured toward a small round table near the window. Upon it rested a crystal bowl, heaped with white sugar lumps, immaculate and angular. "It was there," she said, her gaze sharpening, "that the sugar tongs should have been silver, slender. They have rested beside that bowl for 15 years. "And yesterday," said Poirot softly, "they were absent." "Yes," quite inexplicably. Her tone suggested not outrage, but affront, an injury to order. "And your sister?" Poirot prompted. Mrs. Penbury's composure faltered at last. Within an hour of tea she complained of severe abdominal distress, dizziness, perspiration. We sent at once for Dr. Mallory. He found nothing conclusive. He suggested perhaps a passing gastric disturbance. Poirot's eyes, bright and attentive, did not waver. "And you do not agree?" "I do not know what to think," she admitted. "Margaret is not fanciful, nor is she careless. She took tea as we all did. She ate nothing unusual, yet she alone was affected." "Your guests?" he asked. "Mr. Nathaniel Harcourt, an old family friend, Miss Lydia Grant, who resides nearby, Mr. Edwin Croydon, my husband's junior partner, and, briefly, Mr. Harold Benton, who called on business and remained only a short while. My husband himself was present, of course, and none of the others suffered ill effects. None, though Mr. Benton left before Margaret complained of discomfort. None." Poirot folded his hands. "Permit me, madam, to examine the scene of this modest drama." She led him to the tea table. It was laid now with precise emptiness. Only the crystal bowl and its contents remained. Poirot bent slightly, examining the polished wood, the arrangement of cups stacked neatly upon a nearby tray. "You noticed the absence of the tongs at what moment?" he inquired. "When I reached to take them," she replied promptly. "It was the most absurd sensation, my hand closing upon nothing. I recall thinking that Margaret must have moved them absent-mindedly, yet she denied it. We searched. They were nowhere to be found." "And the sugar?" he asked. "We used it as always, with the fingers. I regret to say, it seemed a trivial breach of propriety." Poirot straightened slowly. "Who first served the tea?" "I did." "You poured for all?" "Yes, and the sugar." Each helped himself or herself. "Except your sister." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "Margaret prefers 2 lumps. I believe I passed the bowl to her. I cannot be certain whether she took them herself or whether I dropped them into her cup." Poirot's gaze lingered upon the crystal facets of the bowl, catching the afternoon light. "May I see your sister?" Margaret Ashcombe lay in a bedroom as orderly as the drawing-room below. She was a woman in her early 40s, pale even before illness, now rendered more so. Her features were delicate, her expression intelligent but strained. "You are the detective," she said quietly. "I am, madam. I am told you were indisposed." She gave a faint smile, a most inelegant word for a most inelegant experience. "Describe it for me, if you please." She complied with clarity. The onset had been swift within 45 minutes of tea, cramping pain, nausea, an oppressive weakness. It had passed gradually over several hours, leaving her exhausted but clear-minded. "Did anything at tea strike you as unusual?" Poirot asked. "Nothing at all," she said, then after a pause. "Except, perhaps, Edwin. Mr. Croydon. Yes, he seemed attentive, too attentive, watching whom? Think." Her eyes shifted away. Poirot observed the motion. "You are not fond of Mr. Croydon?" "I scarcely know him," she replied. "He joined my brother-in-law's firm a year ago. Ambitious, polished, a little too polished." Poirot inclined his head. "And Mr. Harcourt?" "A dear friend, almost family." "And Miss Grant?" "A neighbor, pleasant, quiet." Poirot thanked her and withdrew, his mind assembling impressions with the care of a watchmaker. In the drawing-room, he requested that all present at the tea be invited for conversation. Mrs. Penbury complied, though not without a faint tightening of her lips. It was clear that public inquiry offended her sense of decorum. They assembled that evening. Mr. Penbury, tall and reserved; Mr. Harcourt, genial and silver-haired; Miss Grant, slim and composed; and Mr. Edwin Croydon, whose immaculate suit and smooth manner seemed designed for admiration. Poirot addressed them collectively. "I investigate not a theft of value," he began, "but a disturbance of order. A pair of sugar tongs disappears. A lady falls ill. These events occur in close proximity. Such coincidence is rarely accidental." Mr. Harcourt chuckled uneasily. "Surely you do not suggest the tongs were responsible for the illness?" "I suggest nothing," said Poirot. "I observe." He turned first to Mr. Penbury. "Sir, you took tea with sugar." "1 lump," he replied. "As always. You served yourself." "Yes, and you recall the tongs?" "I confess I do not. I would not have noticed their absence." Poirot nodded. He addressed Mr. Harcourt next. The gentleman had taken no sugar at all. "Too sweet for me these days," he explained lightly. Miss Grant had taken 1 lump, lifting it delicately between her fingers. "I did remark that the tongs were missing," she said. "It seemed odd. Adela keeps everything in its place." "And you, Mr. Croydon?" Poirot asked. "2 lumps," he replied smoothly. "Mrs. Penbury handed me the bowl. And you employed your fingers." Regrettably, Poirot's eyes lingered on his hands, long well kept, but with faint discoloration along one fingertip, as though from recent contact with some chemical agent. "You are engaged in business with Mr. Penbury?" Poirot continued. "Yes, we deal in fine metals and imported goods." "Silver, perhaps," Poirot suggested mildly. Croydon smiled. "Among other things." A silence settled, thin but perceptible. Poirot dismissed them with courteous thanks. He remained alone with Mrs. Penbury. "Your sister," he said gently. "Is she possessed of independent means?" "Yes, our father left us equal shares." "And if she were to, how shall I put it, become permanently indisposed?" Mrs. Penbury's eyes widened. "Surely you cannot mean—" "I mean only to inquire who benefits from her welfare, and who from her misfortune." "My husband and I have no need of Margaret's portion," she said firmly. "And Mr. Croydon?" Poirot asked softly. She hesitated. "He has shown interest in Margaret. She does not reciprocate." Poirot rose and approached the tea table once more. He lifted the crystal bowl and examined its base. There, nearly imperceptible, lay a faint residue, no more than a dusting clinging to one interior facet. "May I take this?" he asked. Of course. I had accompanied Poirot throughout the day, and though he had spoken little of his conclusions, I observed that his mind was far from settled. Poirot conducted a modest experiment. A single sugar lump, moistened and touched lightly against the residue, produced after some minutes a faint bitterness. He sat back, his expression grave. The next morning he returned to the Penbury house with a small sealed envelope. Dr. Mallory was present. "I have had this analyzed," Poirot announced. "It contains traces of a mild but effective irritant, sufficient to produce the symptoms described, yet unlikely to cause lasting harm." Mrs. Penbury gasped softly. "But how?" demanded Mr. Penbury. Poirot's gaze moved calmly to Edwin Croydon. "The sugar tongs," he said, "were not stolen for their value. They were removed because they would have interfered." Croydon's composure flickered. Interfered with what? "With a plan," said Poirot evenly. "If one desired that a particular person consume a prepared sugar lump, treated delicately, invisibly, one must ensure that she alone receives it. If she were to use the tongs, she might select any lump, but if the bowl were passed directly, and another hand, steady, deliberate, chose for her." He turned to Mrs. Penbury. "You believe you passed the bowl, but in that moment of distraction, who stood nearest?" Her hand flew to her mouth. "Mr. Croydon." Poirot inclined his head. "The tongs, had they been present, would have allowed each guest to choose freely without contact. Their absence necessitated the use of fingers, thus permitting the substitution of a prepared lump." Dr. Mallory frowned. "But why such a mild agent?" "To test," said Poirot quietly. "To alarm, to demonstrate vulnerability. A lady made suddenly conscious of frailty may look for protection. From whom? From the attentive gentleman who alone appears concerned." All eyes fixed upon Croydon. "This is absurd," he said, though his voice had lost its polish. "You deal in imported goods," Poirot continued. "Among them certain chemical substances. The faint discoloration upon your fingertip suggests recent handling. The disappearance of the tongs suggests foresight. The illness of Miss Ashcombe suggests intention." "And the tongs?" demanded Mr. Penbury harshly. Poirot withdrew a small folded tissue from his coat pocket. "I found this morning in the waste receptacle behind the shrubbery. It bears faint traces of silver polish and chemical residue. You see, Mr. Croydon, precision must extend to every detail. One forgets that what is used must also be disposed of." Silence fell, heavy and decisive. Margaret Ashcombe, pale but upright, stood in the doorway. "You wish to frighten me," she said steadily, "to make me dependent." Croydon's shoulders sagged. Poirot regarded him not with triumph, but with measured disappointment. "A trifle disturbed," he murmured. "A small object misplaced. Yet from such trifles one may read the disorder of a soul." Thus ended the first act of a mystery that had begun with silver scarcely noticed and concluded with character laid bare. And though the sugar tongs were believed to have been accounted for, Hercule Poirot knew well that order, once shaken, is never quite so simple again. Chapter 2. The order of tea in a house such as that of Mrs. Adela Penbury is not an act of refreshment. It is a ceremony. It advances not in haste but in harmony, each gesture governed by habit, each courtesy shaped by long practice. One might have supposed that such regularity would render recollection simple. Yet I have observed, more than once, that where routine is strongest, memory is weakest, the mind, lulled by repetition, ceases to attend. Hercule Poirot returned to the Penbury residence the morning following his quiet exposure of Mr. Edwin Croydon's stratagem. The matter of the irritant had been addressed with discretion. Croydon, confronted with the evidence, and with the cold disapproval of those whose esteem he valued, had withdrawn from the household, and shortly thereafter, from Mr. Penbury's firm. The incident, outwardly, was concluded. Yet Poirot was not satisfied. For though the attempted manipulation of Miss Margaret Ashcombe had been explained, there remained a subtle discord, a note faint but persistent. It concerned not merely the disappearance of the sugar tongs, but the recollections offered regarding them. The ritual was precise, Poirot remarked to me later, as we walked from his lodgings toward the square. But the memory of that ritual, that was most imprecise. When the choreography is perfect, why should the witnesses stumble, he had requested. under the pretext of completing certain formalities, that the household permit him to reconstruct the events of the tea exactly as they had occurred. Mrs. Penbury agreed, though her composure bore now a trace of strain. The knowledge that a calculated design had unfolded at her own table offended her deeply. If there were further irregularities, she wished them brought to light, provided, as she said, that no unnecessary spectacle was made of it. The drawing-room had been restored to its accustomed serenity. The crystal bowl stood once more beside the newly recovered tongs, polished until they shone with renewed virtue. Cups and saucers were arranged as they had been on that afternoon. "All is as before," Mrs. Penbury said quietly. "Not entirely," Poirot replied, "but we shall pretend." He requested that each of those present at the original tea be summoned once more. They came: Mr. Penbury, grave and attentive; Mr. Nathaniel Harcourt, whose geniality had acquired a shade of caution; Miss Lydia Grant, composed but observant; and Margaret Ashcombe, still pale yet resolute. Poirot surveyed them with calm satisfaction. "Let us take our places," he said. "We shall enact again the order of tea." Mrs. Penbury resumed her role as hostess. The teapot was lifted. Steam rose in gentle spirals, clouding the air with its fragrance. "On the afternoon in question," Poirot began, "who was seated at the hostess's right?" "Mr. Harcourt," Mrs. Penbury replied. "And at her left?" "My sister. And opposite, my husband and Miss Grant." "And Mr. Croydon, beside Margaret," said Mr. Penbury curtly. Poirot nodded. "Then we proceed." The tea was poured. First for Mr. Harcourt, as the eldest guest. He accepted it with a faint, almost apologetic smile. "No sugar for me," he said, echoing his earlier declaration. "Never sugar?" Poirot inquired. "Never," Harcourt replied firmly. "My physician's orders." "Ah!" The cup was passed to Margaret. She watched the proceedings with visible concentration. "2 cubes," she said softly. "And who supplied them?" Poirot asked. Margaret hesitated. "I believed it was Adela." Mrs. Penbury's brow furrowed. "I do not distinctly remember placing them in your cup." Poirot raised a hand gently. "Let us attend carefully. On that day the tongs were absent. Therefore, someone must have touched the sugar directly." "Yes," Miss Grant interjected. "I recall remarking upon it. I found it awkward." "You noticed the absence before Miss Ashcombe took her sugar?" "I think so." "You think?" She colored slightly. "It is difficult to be exact." "Just so," said Poirot. They proceeded. Mr. Penbury accepted 1 cube, selecting it himself from the bowl. Miss Grant took one as well. Mr. Croydon, in the reenactment represented only by an empty chair, would have taken 2. Poirot observed the sequence with minute attention, the angle at which the bowl was passed, the natural tendency of each hand, the slight rotation of the table as elbows shifted against it. "Now," he said at last, "we must address a small inconsistency." All eyes turned toward him. "Mr. Harcourt," he continued, "you decline sugar entirely. Therefore, on the afternoon in question, the bowl passed from Mrs. Penbury directly to Miss Ashcombe. Is that correct?" "Yes," said Harcourt. "And yet," Poirot went on, "Miss Grant, you stated you noticed the absence of the tongs before Miss Ashcombe took her sugar. How is this possible, if the bowl had not yet been offered to you?" Miss Grant's composure flickered. "I may have been mistaken as to the exact moment." "Perhaps," said Poirot mildly. "But memory, when it blurs, does so for a reason." Mrs. Penbury stiffened. "Are you suggesting that someone else tampered with the sugar?" "I suggest nothing. I observe that, although Mr. Croydon's design has been exposed, the choreography of that tea contains another irregular step." He approached the table and lifted the bowl. "Consider this. If one desired to introduce into a particular cup a prepared sugar lump, one must ensure proximity to that cup at the appropriate moment. Mr. Croydon was seated beside Miss Ashcombe. That is true. Yet the bowl, once passed, rested briefly here, before Mr. Harcourt. But I took none," Harcourt protested. "Just so," said Poirot. "You took none, Yet you held the bowl. A silence settled. Harcourt's genial expression faded. Surely you do not imply. I imply only that opportunity is not confined to one chair. Margaret's eyes widened slightly. Nathaniel has known me since childhood. And affection, Poirot said gently, is not incompatible with design. Mrs. Penbury rose abruptly. This is intolerable. Mr. Croydon confessed. He confessed to removing the tongs and introducing an irritant, Poirot replied calmly. He did not confess to placing the sugar in Miss Ashcombe's cup. He assumed, perhaps, that the effect would be observed regardless of who delivered the cube. Mr. Penbury stared at him. You mean? I mean that the plan required two elements, preparation and execution. Mr. Croydon may have prepared the sugar, but who ensured that the correct cup received it? The room seemed to contract. Harcourt's hands resting upon his cane tightened imperceptibly. You are chasing phantoms, he said. Though his voice lacked conviction, Poirot regarded him steadily. You are a gentleman of long standing in this household. You are trusted implicitly. You decline sugar always. Thus no suspicion could attach to you from the bowl. You hold it briefly, pass it onward, and in that instant, if a prepared cube rests between your fingers, you may deposit it without remark. Miss Grant inhaled sharply. But why? Margaret whispered. Poirot's gaze did not waver from Harcourt's face. That is the question which remains. Harcourt rose slowly. For a moment he appeared older than his years, the genial mask dissolving into something sterner. I would never harm Margaret, he said. Harm need not be permanent, Poirot replied. Alarm suffices. Mrs. Penbury stared at him in dawning horror. You wish to frighten her, so that she would cling to you instead of that opportunistic upstart. Harcourt finished bitterly. Yes, I did. The confession hung in the air like steam above a kettle, visible, then vanishing. I saw what he intended. Harcourt continued, his voice low. I believed I could forestall him. If she were unsettled, if she distrusted him, she would not be drawn in. So you collaborated? Poirot asked quietly. I acted alone. I knew nothing of his chemical nonsense. I merely ensured that the cube he had prepared reached her cup. I thought it a mild discomfort at worst. A lesson. Margaret's face had grown very still. You chose to teach me, she said. Harcourt flinched. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Thus the ritual was precise, yet recollection was imprecise. Each concealed a fragment. Mr. Croydon removed the tongs and prepared the sugar. Mr. Harcourt, believing himself protector, completed the act. The choreography required two dancers. Mrs. Penbury sank back into her chair. It was tea, she murmured. Only tea. No, said Poirot gently. It was pride. It was jealousy. It was the quiet assumption that one may arrange another's life as one arranges cups upon a tray. Margaret rose, her frailty replaced by something resolute. You have all presumed, she said, her voice steady. One to frighten me, another to rescue me, and others to observe politely. I require none of you to manage my destiny. No one answered. Poirot replaced the bowl carefully beside the tongs. The order of tea, he said softly, is designed to express civility. When that order is subverted, even for what one imagines to be benevolent reasons, the disturbance reveals the truth of character. He turned to Harcourt. You intended protection. You delivered humiliation. Reflect upon the difference. As we departed, I ventured to ask whether the matter was truly settled. For the moment, Poirot replied. But observe, my friend, in this small drama of sugar and silver, we have discovered ambition, jealousy, presumption, and pride. Such forces do not vanish because a teacup is emptied. He glanced back once at the house, serene and symmetrical against the afternoon light. The ritual has been restored, he said thoughtfully. Yet I suspect that this household has not seen the last of its disturbances. Chapter 3. The silver set had been presented to Mrs. Penbury upon the occasion of her marriage, a gift from an aunt whose devotion to propriety exceeded even that of her niece. It was not displayed for common use. Rather, it was brought forth for those gatherings at which ceremony was considered not merely appropriate, but essential. The set comprised a teapot, cream jug, sugar bowl with lid, and the slender sugar tongs whose brief disappearance had disturbed so much more than the arrangement of a table. Each piece rested within a glass-fronted cabinet in the dining room, lined with dark velvet that rendered the silver almost luminous in contrast. It was, in short, a shrine to order. Hercule Poirot stood before this cabinet with his hands lightly clasped behind his back. "One does not steal from such a collection without thought," he observed quietly. "Nor does one misplace an object so habitually counted." Mrs. Penbury, who had insisted upon being present, inclined her head. "After every use, the pieces are returned, polished if necessary, and checked. Nothing is ever left unattended." "Never?" Poirot asked. She hesitated. "Almost never." The butler, Mr. Graves, had been summoned. He was a tall, spare man with hair as disciplined as the household he served. His expression bore the faint offense of one whose domain has been questioned. "You polished the tongs on the morning of the tea?" Poirot asked. "I did, sir," Graves replied, "at 11:30. I recall it distinctly because the weather was damp and the silver had lost a little of its brightness." "You replaced them in the cabinet?" "Yes, sir, upon the velvet tray with the other pieces, and thereafter they remained undisturbed until Mrs. Penbury instructed me to lay the tea service at 3:45. "You yourself placed the tongs beside the sugar bowl?" Graves paused. "No, sir. The tray was conveyed to the drawing-room by Miss Ellen. The maid, a fair young woman with anxious eyes, stepped forward at the mention of her name. I set the tray exactly as I have done a dozen times," she said quickly. "The bowl, the lid, the tongs, everything in its place." "You are certain the tongs were present?" Poirot asked gently. "Yes, sir. I remember because they slipped slightly as I set them down. I adjusted them so they lay straight." Poirot's gaze sharpened almost imperceptibly. "They slipped. Only a little, sir. The tray is smooth." "And after you left the room?" "I did not return until the tea things were cleared." "No one else entered in the interval?" Mrs. Penbury answered. "We were all in the drawing-room from shortly before 4. I believe Mr. Harcourt arrived first, then Miss Grant. My husband and Mr. Croydon were already present." Poirot turned once more to the cabinet. He requested that the sugar bowl and tongs be brought to the dining table under stronger light. The silver gleamed obediently. He examined the tongs first. They were slender indeed, the tips delicately serrated to grip a cube without fracture. He measured their alignment with a practiced eye. "No recent bending," he murmured. "No sign of strain." Next he lifted the sugar bowl. Its crystal surface caught the light with deceptive innocence. Along the rim, however, he paused. "There," he said softly. Faint scratches marked the interior edge, thin, almost invisible, yet distinct from the gentle wear of years. They were recent. The crystal bore a brightness around them not yet dulled by time. "Something struck here," Poirot continued, "not violently, but with firmness." Mrs. Penbury leaned closer. "I have never noticed that before." "Because it was not there before," he replied. Mr. Graves stiffened. "I should have observed, not necessarily," Poirot interrupted kindly. "One does not examine crystal for battle scars." He lifted the lid and peered within. The sugar cubes lay in tidy ranks, each a perfect white square. He selected one and turned it between his fingers. "To the eye," he said, "they are identical, yet the eye is a complacent instrument." He asked that a fresh plate be brought. Upon it he arranged several cubes in a line. "On the afternoon of the illness," he said, addressing the room at large, "Miss Ashcombe received 2 cubes. We know that an irritant had been applied to at least one. Mr. Croydon admitted to preparing such a cube. Mr. Harcourt admitted to ensuring its delivery. Margaret, pale but composed, stood near the doorway, listening without interruption. But Poirot continued, "I am troubled by a detail. The scratches upon the bowl suggest that the tongs, or some other implement, struck the rim with unusual pressure. The tongs were missing, Mrs. Penbury said faintly. Precisely. Therefore the scratches were not made during the tea itself, unless the tongs were present longer than supposed. Silence met this observation. Poirot selected the tongs and deliberately lifted a cube, allowing the metal to tap lightly against the rim. The sound was delicate. The contact left no visible mark. He repeated the motion, this time applying greater force. A faint line appeared upon the crystal, much like those already observed. One does not ordinarily strike sugar with such determination, he said. Why would one do so? To break a lump, suggested Miss Grant. But these cubes are uniform, Poirot replied. There is no need to break them. He placed the tongs aside, and instead pressed a cube between thumb and forefinger, applying gradual pressure. The cube fractured with a crisp snap. Aha, he murmured. He examined the broken interior. It appeared homogeneous, until he paused and leaned closer. Interesting. He broke another cube, then a third. In two of them, nothing unusual appeared. In the fourth, however, there was a faint discoloration at the center, a minute, almost imperceptible shadow. Mrs. Penbury gasped. You see, Poirot said quietly, the irritant was not applied merely to the surface. It was introduced within. Dr. Mallory, who had joined them at Poirot's request, stepped forward. Injected, or absorbed, while the cube was partially dissolved and then allowed to dry. Poirot replied. Either method would require handling, and perhaps pressure with an implement. He glanced at the rim again. If one wished to conceal such preparation, one might hold the cube in the tongs and press it firmly against the side while introducing the substance. The pressure might leave these marks. But the tongs were in the cabinet until shortly before tea, Mr. Penbury protested. So we are told, said Poirot gently. All eyes shifted, almost involuntarily, to the servants. Graves drew himself up. Sir, I have served this household for 22 years, and I do not question your loyalty, Poirot replied calmly. But loyalty does not render one invisible to circumstance. Miss Ellen's hands trembled slightly. I never touched the sugar, sir. I believe you, said Poirot. He turned once more to Mrs. Penbury, who had access to the cabinet between 11:30 and 3:40. 5, she considered. The dining room was not locked. Was anyone alone in it? There was a pause. Margaret spoke then. I was. They all looked at her. I went in shortly after luncheon, she continued quietly. I wished to write a letter at the side desk. I recall passing the cabinet, but I did not open it. Poirot's eyes rested on her with grave attention. You are certain? Yes. And you felt quite well at that time, perfectly. Mr. Harcourt shifted uncomfortably. Surely you do not suspect Margaret herself? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he lifted the lid once more and surveyed the sugar within. My friends, he said at last, we have discovered that the preparation of the cube was more deliberate than first supposed. It required time, access, and composure. Mr. Croydon may have intended mischief. Mr. Harcourt may have delivered it. But the scratches upon this bowl suggest rehearsal, experimentation. Rehearsal, Mrs. Penbury echoed. Yes, one does not risk so careful a plan without practice. He placed the broken cubes carefully upon the plate. Appearances, he continued softly, are accomplished liars. The silver gleams. The sugar seems innocent. The ritual unfolds with grace. Yet beneath the surface lies calculation. He closed the lid with measured care. I shall require, he said, a complete account of every person who entered this dining room on that day, and on the day before. The serenity of the household, already strained, tightened further. For if the sugar was prepared within this house, Poirot concluded, then the disturbance we have witnessed is not an intrusion from without. It is born of the silver set itself. Chapter 4. The Visitor. It is a curious thing, in a household devoted to symmetry, how readily an intruder may be disguised as a friend. One calls him a visitor. One offers him tea. One permits his chair to stand within the circle of civility. Yet the room, if one watches closely, responds, a pause too long before a reply. a teacup set down with faint emphasis, an eyelid lowering a fraction too slowly. Tension does not announce itself. It flows beneath the surface, like a submerged current, disturbing only the reflections. Hercule Poirot had already reconstructed the tea and examined the silver with the painstaking reverence of a jeweler weighing a stone. Yet another name, mentioned only in passing by the maid, and then repeated reluctantly by Mrs. Penbury, began to shine through the narrative like a thread of dark silk in pale fabric. There was another guest, Poirot said quietly, seated once more in the Penbury drawing-room. You did not mention him at first. Mrs. Penbury's mouth tightened. Because he was scarcely a guest. He arrived unexpectedly. Unexpectedly, Poirot repeated. And yet he was received. We could hardly refuse him, said Mr. Penbury stiffly. Mr. Harold Benton had business with me. It would have been discourteous. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly in that attentive way of his that never appeared hostile, yet never missed its mark. Busyness, he said. Tell me of this business. Mr. Penbury's hand moved as though to straighten a paper that was not there. A partnership arrangement, a supply contract. I do not see how it pertains. Poirot was gentle. Often, sir, the motive enters by the door of business and sits quietly in the corner of a drawing-room. Mrs. Penbury spoke then, her voice carefully controlled. There has been talk. Mr. Benton is persuasive. He concluded, an arrangement with my husband that, some say, favored him generously. And who says so? Poirot asked. A pause. My sister, Mrs. Penbury admitted at last, with a faint reluctance. Margaret, who sat in an armchair near the fire, lifted her chin. I do not repeat gossip, she said. I read documents. I asked questions. Harold Benton may be agreeable, but his agreements are always agreeable to himself. Mr. Penbury flushed. Margaret, you exceed your place. My place is precisely where it has always been, she replied evenly. In this family, in this house, at this table. Poirot watched them with a kind of quiet satisfaction. Here, at last, was the hidden tension made visible, a fault line running beneath the household's polished surface. And Mr. Benton came to tea, Poirot said softly, because he wished to smooth this fault line, or to widen it. Mr. Penbury hesitated. He came to deliver certain papers for signature, and he remained. He was invited to stay. Mrs. Penbury said quickly, though her eyes did not meet Margaret's. Poirot nodded, and in his mind the choreography shifted. Another chair, another pair of hands, another set of eyes. He asked that Mr. Benton be invited to call that afternoon. As a formality, Mrs. Penbury phrased it. She did so, reluctantly. A discreet messenger was sent. Mr. Benton, it seemed, was not difficult to summon. He arrived at 4 o'clock, punctual as a man accustomed to controlling the moment of his entrance. He was in his late 40s, well-built, clean-shaven, with hair brushed back from a broad forehead. His manner was agreeable, so agreeable, in fact, that it suggested practice rather than temperament. Mr. Poirot, he said, offering his hand warmly. A pleasure. I have heard of you, though I confess I did not expect to find myself connected to domestic disturbances. His eyes traveled briefly, very briefly, over the room, taking in each face, Mr. Penbury's guarded rigidity, Mrs. Penbury's controlled unease, Margaret's cool watchfulness. Then his gaze settled upon Poirot with an expression of open curiosity. Poirot gestured toward a chair. We speak only of tea, Mr. Benton. Benton's smile widened. Tea is often the beginning of more serious matters. Ah, said Poirot, you understand. Benton sat. He crossed one leg neatly over the other. Everything about him suggested moderation, measured speech, measured movement, measured civility. I was present that afternoon, Benton said readily, but I left early, I believe, before Miss Ashcombe felt unwell. That is correct, Poirot replied, and yet your presence was not mentioned immediately. Why, do you think? Benton's smile did not fade, but a faint tightening appeared at its edges. Perhaps because I am not entirely loved in this house. Margaret's eyes sharpened. You are tolerated. she corrected. He inclined his head toward her, as though acknowledging a compliment. You see, honesty. Poirot regarded him thoughtfully. Tell me, Mr. Benton, you sweeten your tea. With 1 cube, Benton said. Always 1. Anything more is indulgence. And you took it yourself? Yes, with the tongs. Benton's expression flickered, as though a memory caught upon something unpleasant. Number they were not there. You noticed their absence. One cannot fail to notice. In a house like this, Benton replied, everything has its place. When a thing is missing, the gap is almost visible. Poirot's eyes gleamed. A perceptive remark. Benton shrugged lightly. It is only observation. Poirot leaned forward slightly. And you observed much that afternoon. Benton's gaze held steady. I observed that Margaret was displeased with me. I observed that Mr. Penbury wished me gone quickly. I observed that Mrs. Penbury was anxious to maintain civility. And I observed, his eyes moved briefly toward Margaret again, that your sister is not a woman easily managed. There was a silence, taut and bright. Poirot broke it gently. You left promptly. Yes, Benton said. I had another appointment, yet there is a suggestion, Poirot continued, that you were the last to reach toward the sugar bowl. A faint pause, Benton's fingers resting upon the arm of the chair, curled slightly and then relaxed. Who suggests this? He asked calmly. A timid voice, Poirot replied. Timid voices often see much because they wish not to be seen themselves. Mrs. Penbury shifted. Miss Ellen, the maid, hovered near the doorway with the strained expression of someone who has already regretted speaking. Poirot did not press her. Instead, he turned again to Benton. The order of tea, he said softly, is choreography. The bowl passes from hand to hand. Each touch is an opportunity. You took 1 cube and left. That is simple, yet simplicity may be a mask. Benton's smile returned, though it was thinner. You do not accuse me of poisoning anyone, Mr. Poirot. I accuse no one, Poirot said mildly. I ask questions. Then ask, Benton replied. Poirot's voice remained gentle. Why did you come to tea unexpectedly? Benton spread his hands. Busyness. I had papers requiring signature. Time is valuable. And the arrangement you concluded, Poirot continued, it is rumored to favor you generously. Benton's eyes brightened with amusement. Rumor is a cheap commodity, Mr. Poirot. People sell it freely. And the reality? The reality, Benton said smoothly, is that Mr. Penbury is a capable man who made an agreement that benefits both parties. Margaret laughed softly, without humor. You always say that, yet somehow the benefit always seems to sit more comfortably in your pocket than in ours. Benton's gaze moved to her with a mild reproach. You dislike me because I do not yield to your scrutiny. I dislike you, she replied, because you prefer others to yield. Poirot watched the exchange with quiet attention. Beneath their civility, the current pulled stronger, he said gently. Mr. Benton, you spoke little at tea, but you observed much, and you left before the illness. That is convenient. Benton's expression hardened for the first time. Only a fraction, but it was there. Convenient for what? He asked. For innocence, Poirot replied. The word fell like a small stone into still water. Benton leaned back, his agreeable mask slipping a little. I do not know what game is being played in this household, he said, but I will not be made a piece upon the board. Poirot's eyes were calm. In my experience, Mr. Benton, those who declare themselves not pieces often wish to be players. A silence stretched. Mr. Penbury's face had grown pale with contained anger. At last Benton rose. If you have no more questions, I shall leave. I came today out of courtesy. I will not return to be interrogated in a drawing room like a criminal. Poirot inclined his head politely. You may go. Benton moved toward the door. As he passed the tea table, his gaze flicked toward the sugar bowl. Again a movement so swift it might have been imagined. Yet Poirot, watching, did not imagine. Benton paused, almost imperceptibly, as though his hand wished to lift. Then he thought better of it and continued out. When the door had closed behind him, Poirot remained silent for a long moment. Mrs. Penbury spoke first, her voice unsteady. "You cannot truly suspect Mr. Benton. He was here only briefly. He took one cube. He left before Margaret." "Precisely," said Poirot softly. "He left before the illness declared itself. He sweetened his tea with one cube, delicately placed. He observed much, he spoke little, and his arrangement with your family is disputed." Mr. Penbury's jaw clenched. "Are you saying he attempted to harm Margaret?" Poirot's gaze rested on him, thoughtful and grave. "I say only this. When one hears a detail offered casually, he was the last to reach toward the sugar bowl. One must not dismiss it. Such a detail is often the most revealing." "One believes the disturbance began with Mr. Croydon," Poirot said quietly. "Then one discovers Mr. Harcourt's hand. Now Mr. Benton enters the scene, the web grows." Margaret's voice came softly from behind him. "If Mr. Benton is involved, it will not be for romance. He does not care for me." Poirot turned to her. "Then," he replied gently, "we must consider what he does care for." She met his gaze steadily. "Control," she said. Poirot nodded, satisfied. "And money," she added, more quietly. Poirot folded his hands. "Yes, and perhaps silence." The room fell still again, as though the house itself held its breath. Poirot's voice, when it came, was calm but edged with warning. "Tea is choreography," he said. "But in choreography, the smallest misplaced step may tell you who intends the fall." Chapter 5. The courier between hands. It is often the humblest object that reveals the most sophisticated design. A jewel proclaims its value. A document declares its purpose. But a sugar tong slender, silver obedient, appears to exist only for courtesy. It is a mediator, a bridge between bowl and cup. It touches what fingers do not. It preserves decorum. Hercule Poirot sat in his armchair that evening, fingertips lightly pressed together, and asked himself a question that might have seemed absurd to any practical mind. "What is a sugar tong?" "It is an instrument of separation," he murmured. "It prevents contact. It leaves no warmth, no trace of skin. It delivers, and it withdraws. If one wished to convey something unseen from cube to liquid, such an instrument would serve admirably. A spoon leaves residue. A hand leaves warmth, perhaps moisture. But the tongs, slim, precise, leave almost nothing beyond the faintest pressure. And yet, in this case, the tongs had vanished. That disappearance had first suggested concealment. Then, through confession, it had suggested premeditated substitution. But the more Poirot reflected, the less he was satisfied with that explanation alone. The scratches upon the crystal rim, the preparation within the cube itself, the choreography of hands. He returned the following morning to the Penbury residence, not with accusation, but with quiet persistence. Mrs. Penbury received him in the smaller morning room, her posture as erect as ever, though the shadows beneath her eyes spoke of sleepless thought. "You are not at peace," she said. "Madam," Poirot replied gently, "peace must be earned by truth. I am not yet persuaded that we possess it." She folded her hands. "You believe Mr. Benton to be involved." "I believe Mr. Benton to be involved." "I believe Mr. Benton to be composed," said Poirot. "And composure, when joined with motive, becomes interesting." Mr. Penbury entered shortly thereafter, summoned at Poirot's request. His manner was restrained, though a certain defensiveness lingered. "You wish to discuss Benton again," he said flatly. "I wish to discuss negotiation," Poirot replied. Margaret joined them, pale but resolute. If she felt herself the axis upon which these events turned, she did not display it. Rather, she listened. Poirot spoke deliberately. "In any business arrangement," he said, "there are voices that support and voices that question. It has been suggested to me that Miss Ashcombe expressed reservations regarding Mr. Benton's recent agreement with this household." "She did more than express reservations," Mr. Penbury said tightly. "She opposed it. "And with influence?" Poirot asked. "My sister is not without means," Mrs. Penbury admitted quietly. "Our father's estate was divided equally. Major decisions are not undertaken without her awareness." Margaret did not flinch. "Harold Benton wished the contract signed quickly," she said. "I asked for review. I delayed." Poirot inclined his head. "Delay is costly to the ambitious." Mr. Penbury shifted uncomfortably. "You suggest that Benton would attempt to remove Margaret from negotiation through illness." "I suggest," Poirot said calmly, "that if Miss Ashcombe were temporarily incapacitated, even briefly, discussions might proceed with less resistance." Margaret's eyes hardened. Mrs. Penbury looked stricken. "Surely not to harm. Harm need not be permanent," Poirot said quietly. "A warning suffices. A demonstration of fragility, one who has been made suddenly ill, may be perceived as unreliable in delicate business." Silence followed that observation. Poirot rose and paced slowly to the tea table, where the silver set had once more been arranged. He lifted the tongs and examined them thoughtfully. "The tongs are not merely utensils," he continued. "They are couriers between hands. They permit the movement of an object without the intrusion of skin. If one wished to introduce a prepared cube into a cup without detection, the tongs would serve admirably." "But they were missing," Mr. Penbury said. "Just so," Poirot replied, "missing at the moment of service. But they existed beforehand. They were polished that morning. They rested in the cabinet. The scratches upon the bowl suggest that they were used firmly against the crystal prior to the tea." He turned toward them. "If the cube was prepared in advance within this house, then someone with access to the silver, and with the composure to experiment, handled those tongs before they disappeared." "The butler," Mrs. Penbury whispered. Poirot shook his head gently. "Mr. Graves' loyalty appears steady. His manner, when questioned, was affronted, not evasive. He counts the silver as though it were sacrament." "And Ellen?" Margaret asked. "The maid fears dismissal more than scandal," Poirot said. "Her anxiety is not the anxiety of guilt, but of position." Mr. Penbury frowned. "Then who?" Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Who had both motive and composure?" The name hung unspoken, yet present. Margaret spoke it first. "Benton." Mrs. Penbury drew a slow breath. "But he is not a member of the household. He would not move freely among the cabinets." "Would he not?" Poirot asked softly. "He arrived that afternoon bearing papers. He may have arrived earlier on previous occasions. He is a man received without suspicion, doors open." Mr. Penbury looked troubled. "He has dined here. He has visited the study." "And the dining room?" Poirot pressed. "Yes, of course." Poirot nodded. "It requires only a few moments, a glance to ensure one is alone. The cabinet is unlocked. The tongs are removed, used to manipulate a cube, perhaps to inject or press within it a substance prepared elsewhere. The cube is replaced among its fellows. The tongs are returned. Later, when tea is served, the tongs are removed again to permit direct handling, thus ensuring that the prepared cube may be delivered by hand." Margaret's voice was quiet, but firm. "And then illness follows. I am weakened. Negotiations proceed. Or," Poirot added, "you are persuaded that your health renders you unfit to scrutinize agreements." Mr. Penbury sank into a chair. "This is monstrous." Poirot's tone remained measured. "It is calculated." He placed the tongs carefully upon the table. "Observe also," he continued, "that Mr. Benton sweetened his tea with a single cube, delicately placed. He reached toward the bowl last, according to a timid voice." Mrs. Penbury glanced toward the doorway, where Ellen stood as though wishing to dissolve into the wallpaper. "I did not mean," the maid began. "You meant only to speak what you saw," Poirot said kindly. "And what you saw is important." He turned back to the family. If Mr. Benton reached last, he had the opportunity to ensure that the remaining prepared cube was removed from the bowl before others might take it. If two such cubes existed, and only one was delivered to Miss Ashcombe, the second must disappear. Margaret's eyes widened. "You believe there was more than one?" "I believe in contingency," Poirot replied. "A cautious mind prepares for failure." The room seemed to shrink around them. Mr. Penbury's voice was strained. "You accuse a man of deliberate manipulation without proof." Poirot's expression was calm. "I do not accuse," he said. "I assemble. The butler lacks motive. The maid lacks composure. Mr. Croydon possessed ambition but not subtlety. Mr. Harcourt possessed emotion but not foresight. Mr. Benton alone combines motive, advantage, and the steady hand required to employ a silver instrument without trembling." Mrs. Penbury pressed her hand to her temple. "If this is true, if it is true," Poirot said quietly, "then the illness was not merely a test of romance or pride. It was a maneuver in negotiation." Margaret rose slowly. "I will not be maneuvered," she said. Poirot inclined his head with approval. "That, madam, is precisely why someone might attempt to do so." He turned toward the window, where the afternoon light lay pale upon the square outside. "A sugar tong," he murmured almost to himself, "is a mediator. It carries sweetness. Yet in this case it may have carried strategy." He faced them once more. "We must not be hasty," he said. "Suspicion is not conviction. But we are no longer dealing with trifles. The silver set has become a courier between hands, and perhaps between intentions." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Then we must discover," she said, "who truly held it." Chapter 6. A pattern of preference. There are habits so small that one might mistake them for quirks of taste. 2 cubes instead of 1, a slight stir rather than a vigorous one. The preference for sweetness to arrive gradually rather than at once. Yet habits are the grooves in which a life runs. To know them is to know how a person will behave when she is not thinking, and to know how she will behave when she is not thinking is to know how she may be guided. Without her consent, Miss Margaret Ashcombe's habit was known. 2 cubes, always 2. She did not heap sugar, she did not sprinkle granules. She chose cubes with care, and she stirred but lightly, allowing sweetness to settle slowly at the bottom of the cup, so that the first mouthful remained almost plain while the last carried a soft indulgence. It was, one might say, a method of savoring, and it suited her character, controlled, deliberate, unwilling to rush even toward pleasure. Mr. Harold Benton knew this as well. They had taken tea together many times during discussions in which he spoke warmly of partnership and progress and mutual benefit, while Margaret listened with that quiet scrutiny that made men feel as though they were being weighed. Benton, who wore courtesy as armor, had learned her rhythms. A man may ignore what a woman says. He rarely ignores how she takes her tea, Poirot said to me, on the morning he pursued this line of inquiry. When you wish to move a person, you do not push from the front. You pull from the place where she already leans. We returned once more to the Penbury house, and if the household had believed that the previous interrogations would conclude the matter, it was mistaken. For Poirot, having traced the movements of hands, now traced the movements of preference. He requested the kitchen. This, in itself, created a small shock. The Penbury household, like most of its kind, did not care to imagine that the mysteries of its drawing-room might have roots in its scullery. Yet kitchens are where order is maintained by labor rather than by appearance, and labor leaves traces. Mrs. Penbury accompanied us with a look of resigned displeasure. Mr. Graves led the way with dignified reluctance, as though conducting a guest to a place beneath his notice. The kitchen was spotless. Even the copper pans gleamed with a chastened brightness. Cook, a round, stern woman named Mrs. Dobson, stood with arms folded, her expression that of one prepared to defend her territory. Poirot greeted her politely and asked, almost conversationally, "Madam, do you keep notes of provisions used for the household?" "We keep accounts, sir," Mrs. Dobson replied, "and I keep my wits, if that is what you're asking."
"Excellent," said Poirot.
"Then tell me, was the sugar bowl replenished shortly before the tea gathering?" Mrs. Dobson's eyes narrowed. "Sugar is always replenished. It is not a jewel. It is used." Poirot smiled faintly. "But not always at the same hour. Not always from the same supply, I ask, because the arrangement of the cubes matters." "The arrangement," she repeated, as though he had spoken nonsense. Poirot gestured toward the pantry shelf, where tins stood in strict ranks. Sugar comes in, sugar goes out. Between these two truths, there is a moment when sugar is poured into the bowl. Who pours it? Ellen fills it if it is low, Mrs. Dobson said grudgingly. Or sometimes I do, if she is elsewhere. Poirot turned to Ellen, who hovered near the doorway like a bird expecting a thrown stone. Did you replenish the bowl before that tea? He asked gently. Ellen's eyes flicked to Mrs. Dobson, then to Mrs. Penbury. Yes, sir, in the early afternoon. At what hour? About 2, she said quickly. Perhaps a little after. And why? It was not full, she replied. Mrs. Penbury likes it full for guests. Poirot nodded. From what supply did you replenish it? The tin, Ellen said, pointing. The one we use. Poirot approached the tin and lifted the lid. Inside were more cubes, identical in size and color to those in the bowl upstairs. He selected a handful and studied them in his palm. Do you pour them on top? He asked. Ellen blinked, confused. Yes, sir. One pours them in. One does not remove the old cubes first? Poirot asked mildly. No, sir. Why would one? They are the same. Poirot's eyes gleamed with quiet satisfaction. You see, he said to me softly. A pattern. The new cubes are stacked upon the old. He thanked Ellen and asked, after you replenished the bowl, did you stir them with your hand? Did you mix? No, sir, she said quickly. I would not. I only pour. Poirot nodded again, and his mind, I knew, was already arranging cubes as though they were pieces on a chessboard. Back in the drawing room, he requested the sugar bowl be brought again and placed before him. Mrs. Penbury, watching closely, looked as though she wished she had never heard of tea. Poirot removed the lid and observed the cubes with such intensity that one might have thought he studied diamonds. Madam, he said to Mrs. Penbury, how often is the bowl topped up? Whenever it is low, she replied. Before guests, certainly. And do you ever empty it fully and refill from the beginning? Rarely, she admitted. There is no need. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the cubes. No need, unless one wishes to hide something in layers. He lifted 2 cubes from the top and placed them upon a saucer. Then he removed 2 cubes from deeper within the bowl and placed them beside the first. To the eye, he said, they are identical, yet we must not trust the eye. Dr. Mallory had been summoned again, reluctantly, but with increasing seriousness. He arrived with his bag and a more wary expression than before. Poirot requested that he examine the cubes, not for appearance, but for the faintest trace of chemical bitterness. Mallory made a simple test, moistening and touching, then observing reaction in a prepared solution, his brow furrowed. The upper cubes, he said slowly, show a faint reaction consistent with what we found before. The lower ones, almost nothing. Mrs. Penbury gasped. Margaret's face grew very still. Poirot placed the cubes down carefully. So, he murmured. The substance was transferred primarily to the uppermost layer. He straightened slightly. The compound was first applied to the inner grip of the tongs. When a cube was held firmly, a minute quantity transferred to its surface. In some instances, slight pressure or partial moistening allowed the substance to penetrate faintly into the cube before drying again. Thus we observe 3 traces: residue upon the metal, contamination upon the uppermost cubes, and occasional discoloration within a fractured interior. All originate from a single method. But how? Mrs. Penbury began. Poirot held up a hand. Consider the advantage. If the bowl contains old cubes at the bottom and new cubes stacked atop, then a substance applied to the top affects only those who select from above. A person who takes from the bottom, who rummages, who is careless, may escape. But a person who takes neatly from the top, always from the top, will be struck. He turned to Margaret. Madam, when you take sugar, you take the 2 nearest cubes, do you not? The ones at the top, properly presented. Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, I do not dig. Poirot inclined his head. And Mr. Benton knows you do not dig. A silence filled the room, thick and unavoidable. Mr. Penbury said hoarsely. That still does not prove Benton applied anything. No, Poirot agreed calmly. It proves design. It proves knowledge of preference. It proves that whoever prepared this did so with an understanding of how Miss Ashcombe selects her sugar. He rose, paced slowly, then turned back. Now we come to something else, he said softly. A deviation. Mrs. Penbury stiffened. What deviation? Poirot's gaze moved to the arrangement of chairs around the tea table. In a household such as this, he said, the host pours, the eldest guest receives first, and sugar is offered with a flourish. Yet I have learned that on the day of the gathering, someone insisted upon serving Miss Ashcombe first. Mrs. Penbury's lips parted. That is not true. Poirot's eyes did not waver. You are certain? She hesitated. Her composure trembled slightly. Margaret spoke then, quiet but clear. It is true. All eyes turned toward her. Benton did it, Margaret continued. He stood as though assisting Adela, almost gallant. He took the bowl in his hand and offered it to me first, saying, We cannot allow the lady to wait for sweetness. Mrs. Penbury's cheeks flushed with embarrassment and anger. It was only politeness. He was being helpful. Helpful, Poirot repeated. Mr. Harcourt, who had been summoned as well, shifted uncomfortably. I remember that now, he said. He did step forward. It seemed harmless. Poirot's voice remained gentle, but its precision cut. It is never harmless to change the order of ritual, he said. Ritual exists precisely to prevent one person from controlling the flow. He turned to Ellen. You saw Mr. Benton serve Miss Ashcombe first. Ellen swallowed. Yes, sir, she whispered. That is what I meant when I said he was the last to reach. He reached so often. He took the bowl, then put it back, then took it again. I thought it strange, but I did not speak. Poirot nodded, not triumphantly, but as one confirming an equation. You were timid, he said kindly. But you were correct. Mrs. Penbury's voice trembled. Why would he do that? Poirot looked at her sadly. Such gallantry often masks design. If Miss Ashcombe must take her sugar from the upper layer, then the one who ensures she is served first ensures she takes from the untouched top, before others may disturb it, before a careless hand may accidentally select the prepared cube and reveal the trick. Margaret's hands tightened on the arms of her chair. So he made certain, she said quietly. Yes, Poirot replied. He made certain. And if the substance were applied only to a small number of cubes, those at the very top, then he might avoid them by selecting from the edge or from a lower spot, with the practiced ease of one who knows precisely which are dangerous. Margaret's voice was low. He may even have removed the second prepared cube afterward. Poirot nodded. A cautious mind prepares for failure. A cautious mind also cleans away evidence. Mrs. Penbury pressed her hand to her mouth. This means he came here intending. It means, Poirot said quietly, that his visit was not merely social. It was tactical. At that moment, Mr. Graves stepped forward, clearing his throat with restrained dignity. There is something else, sir, he said. Poirot turned to him at once. Yes. Graves held out a small book, an account ledger. Mr. Benton's clerk delivered a parcel yesterday morning. It was addressed to Mr. Penbury. I brought it to the study. Mr. Benton himself came later and asked for it. He said he had forgotten to include a necessary document. Mr. Penbury stared. I remember now. He did ask. And you gave it to him? Poirot asked. Yes, sir, Graves replied. He carried it himself. Poirot's eyes gleamed. So Mr. Benton entered the study. He retrieved a parcel. He may have been alone in the house for a moment. Graves nodded slowly. It is possible, sir. Poirot looked toward Mrs. Penbury. And from the study, he said softly, one passes the dining room, and in the dining room there is the cabinet. The room seemed to grow colder. Margaret's gaze fixed upon the tea table as though she could see, in memory, Benton's hand lifting the bowl with practiced ease, his voice light, his manner charming. 2 cubes, she murmured. Always 2. Poirot's voice was quiet, almost gentle. "A pattern of preference, madam. It is the easiest thing in the world to exploit when one has watched you often enough." Mr. Penbury's voice was strained. "Then what do we do?" Poirot's expression was composed, but there was something hard beneath it now, a moral certainty that did not permit flinching. "We do not confront him with anger," he said. "We confront him with arrangement. We give him the opportunity to repeat his method under observation. We allow him to believe that his pattern still holds." Mrs. Penbury's eyes widened. "You mean another tea?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, another tea, another choreography." Margaret's face remained steady. "And if he refuses?" Poirot's gaze met hers. "He will not refuse," he said quietly. "Because men like Mr. Benton believe that courtesy is a door they may open whenever they choose. And when the door opens again, we shall be waiting on the other side." He lifted the sugar tongs delicately, as though weighing their significance. "The mediator between bowl and cup," he murmured. "So precise, so slim, so innocent, and yet it may carry more than sweetness." He set them down. "In this case," he said softly, "the pattern has revealed the hand. Now we must reveal the mind." Chapter 7. The hidden evidence. It is in the nature of concealed things to reveal themselves not by noise, but by patience. One does not always discover evidence by searching where it ought to be. One finds it where it has been hidden in haste, in confidence, or in arrogance. The sugar tongs, long presumed to have been merely misplaced during the earlier confusion, had in fact never been formally restored to the cabinet at all. That fact, when it came to light, did not astonish Hercule Poirot. It confirmed him. The discovery was made by accident, so it was said. Mr. Graves, executing his routine inspection of the study, noticed that the lining of a small writing desk stood slightly raised at one corner. The desk was not part of the principal furnishings of the room. It had been brought into the house some months prior for Mr. Harold Benton's convenience during negotiations. It was smaller than Mr. Penbury's imposing bureau and had been placed near the window for light. Benton used it when reviewing contracts, claiming it allowed him a clearer perspective. Perspective, as Poirot later observed, depends very much on where one chooses to stand. Graves, ever meticulous, pressed the lining flat. It resisted. Lifting it carefully, he felt something solid beneath, a narrow object, metallic. He summoned Mrs. Penbury. She in turn sent for Poirot at once. When we arrived, the study held an atmosphere unlike the drawing-room's polite tension. Here the air felt close, as though secrets had been breathing within it. The desk stood open. The lining had been peeled back. Beneath it lay the sugar tongs. Mrs. Penbury clasped her hands tightly together. Margaret stood very still. Mr. Penbury's face was a mask of disbelief that was slowly cracking. Poirot did not gasp. He did not exclaim. He merely stepped forward, bent slightly, and examined the object with a gaze that was neither triumphant nor surprised. "Ah," he said softly, "so the courier has returned, though not to its proper station." The tongs were lifted carefully with a handkerchief and placed upon blotting paper. Under the light from the window, a faint crystalline residue could be seen along the inner edges, barely visible, yet distinct from the smooth polish of silver. "That is not sugar," Poirot murmured. Dr. Mallory was summoned again, and this time his examination was less tentative. A small scraping was taken and tested. The result was swift. "It is consistent," he said gravely, "with the compound previously detected in the sugar, mild in quantity, but effective. Enough to cause distress, not enough to leave permanent damage." Mrs. Penbury's composure broke. "Then it was deliberate," she whispered. "Yes," Poirot replied quietly. "It was no accident." Margaret's gaze did not leave the tongs. Someone applied the substance using the instrument itself. "Precisely," said Poirot. "The tongs were not merely removed to permit manual selection. They were used to prepare." Mr. Penbury ran a hand over his brow. "But the tongs were in the cabinet that morning. Graves polished them. Ellen set them out. Then they vanished. Croydon confessed to removing them." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "Croydon confessed to removing them during tea." He did not confess to using them beforehand. Silence fell. "The scratches on the sugar bowl," Margaret said slowly. "Yes," Poirot replied. "Pressure applied while holding a cube within the tongs. Enough force to mark crystal. One might grip the cube, press the compound into its surface, or perhaps inject and then dry it, while ensuring no residue touched the fingers." Mrs. Penbury looked stricken. "And afterward?" "Afterward," said Poirot calmly, "the tongs must be concealed. To leave them openly would invite inspection. To return them to the cabinet would risk discovery during counting, so they were hidden temporarily." The desk, modest in size but finely constructed, stood with its drawers partially open. Its leather writing surface was worn in places where documents had rested. It did not belong to the Penbury household originally. It had been brought at Benton's suggestion, ostensibly for convenience during extended discussions. Poirot ran a gloved finger lightly along its edge. "This desk," he said, "belongs not to the servants, nor to Miss Ashcombe, nor even to Mr. Penbury in practice. It is Mr. Benton's chosen station when he works here." Mr. Penbury's voice was strained. "He uses it. It is not his property." "No," Poirot agreed gently, "but possession is sometimes a matter of habit, not ownership." Margaret spoke quietly. "He excused himself during tea." "Yes," Poirot replied. A brief absence, a moment sufficient to step into the study. Mrs. Penbury turned sharply. "You think he hid them then?" "I think," said Poirot, "that if one had used the tongs to prepare the sugar earlier, perhaps on a previous visit, one would require a place to conceal them once the disturbance began. During tea, when suspicion first flickered at their absence, Mr. Croydon may have removed them visibly. But if they were already tainted, their presence would be dangerous." Mr. Penbury stared at him. "You suggest 2 removals?" "Yes," Poirot replied calmly. "The first removal, to use the tongs in preparation. The second removal, to create distraction." Margaret's eyes widened slightly. Croydon's confession may have served Benton. Poirot inclined his head. "It is convenient when another's foolish ambition obscures one's deliberate calculation." The household absorbed this in silence. The earlier narrative, of romantic manipulation and misguided gallantry, now seemed almost naive in comparison. Dr. Mallory cleared his throat. "The compound was applied directly to the inner surfaces of the tongs. That suggests deliberate handling." "And composure," Poirot added. "One must apply such a substance with steadiness. One must measure. One must test." Mrs. Penbury shuddered faintly. "In our home." Poirot's voice softened. "Madam, the appearance of sanctuary does not prevent intrusion of will." Margaret moved closer to the desk. She looked at it not as furniture, but as accomplice. "He asked for privacy once," she said slowly. "To review a clause. He remained in here alone." "When was this?" Poirot asked. 2 days before the tea." Poirot nodded, as though another piece had fallen neatly into place. "And did he request tea during that visit?" "Yes," Margaret said. "Ellen brought it." "And sugar?" "Yes." Poirot's eyes gleamed. Then he had opportunity, alone with sugar, alone with silver. Mrs. Penbury pressed her hand to her lips. "But why hide the tongs beneath the lining rather than dispose of them entirely?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Because disposal is conspicuous. A missing object invites inquiry. A hidden object invites none, until found." Mr. Benton likely intended to retrieve them later, when suspicion had cooled. He bent again and examined the lining. It had been lifted with care, not torn. The tongs had been placed neatly, aligned with the wood grain, as though even concealment required order. "A man who values precision," Poirot murmured. Mr. Penbury's voice trembled between anger and disbelief. "If this is true, then he used our house as a laboratory." "Yes," said Poirot quietly, "and your hospitality as cover." The weight of that statement settled heavily upon the room. Margaret's gaze sharpened. "Then there is no longer doubt." Poirot looked at her with measured calm. "There is evidence," he said. "But we must still ask, who applied the substance and who placed the tongs here?" Mr. Penbury frowned. The desk belonged to Benton in practice. He excused himself during tea. The residue matches the compound. What more is required? Poirot did not answer at once. He walked slowly around the desk, considering. The placement beneath the lining was deliberate, but not desperate, he said. It was hidden, yet not buried. That suggests confidence. In what? Mrs. Penbury asked. In control, Poirot replied. He straightened and faced them all. Mr. Benton is a man who understands advantage. He knew Miss Ashcombe opposed his arrangement. He knew her habits. He had access to the silver and the sugar. He excused himself during tea at a moment when attention was divided, and the instrument used to prepare the tainted cubes was found beneath the lining of the desk he habitually used. He paused, allowing the facts to settle in orderly formation. It is no accident, he concluded quietly. Margaret's voice was steady. Then we confront him. Poirot's gaze sharpened, not with excitement, but with purpose. Yes, he said, but not yet with accusation. We confront him with knowledge, arranged as carefully as he arranged his cubes. Mrs. Penbury drew a trembling breath. And, if he denies it? Poirot's expression did not change. He will deny, he said, but denial, when placed beside evidence, becomes brittle. He looked once more at the tongs resting upon the blotting paper. The question, he said softly, is not whether they were used. The residue answers that. The question is whether Mr. Benton believed himself unseen. He has always believed that, she said. Poirot inclined his head. Then, he replied, it is time he was corrected. Chapter 8, Reconstruction of the Act. There are moments in every investigation when the scattered fragments of truth must be arranged into a single coherent line. Facts by themselves are inert. It is only when placed in sequence, each one following naturally upon the other, that they acquire force. Hercule Poirot, having examined the silver, the sugar, the desk, and the residue, requested that the principal members of the household assemble once more in the drawing-room. This time there was no pretense of casual inquiry. The air held expectation, and something sharper beneath it. Mr. Harold Benton had been invited, politely, formally, without hint of accusation. He arrived with his usual composure, though his eyes moved swiftly upon entering, as though measuring the distance to each face. Poirot stood near the tea-table, the sugar bowl before him, the restored tongs laid carefully upon a folded napkin. Mr. Benton, he began quietly, we are gathered not to speculate, but to understand. Permit me, therefore, to recount the scene as it must have occurred. Benton smiled faintly. I am curious to hear it. Poirot inclined his head. You had concluded a business arrangement with Mr. Penbury. It was favorable, very favorable, to you, Miss Ashcombe. However, proved resistant. She read carefully. She questioned terms. She delayed. Benton's expression did not alter. Delay, Poirot continued, is inconvenient when profit depends upon momentum. A signature withheld is capital suspended. Mr. Penbury shifted uncomfortably. Margaret remained still. You understood Miss Ashcombe's habits, Poirot said. You had taken tea with her many times. You knew she preferred 2 cubes, always 2. You knew she selected from the uppermost layer. You knew she stirred lightly. Benton gave a small shrug. Such things are hardly secrets. Precisely, said Poirot. They are not secrets. They are patterns, and patterns are the instruments of the observant. Poirot moved one step closer to the table. You requested tea in the study. You had access to the sugar bowl, and through the unlocked cabinet, to the silver tongs. Benton's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly against the arm of his chair. During that moment, Poirot continued calmly, you treated the inner grip of the tongs with a mild compound, distressing but not fatal. You did not wish to kill, you wished to alarm. A faint murmur passed through the room. Poirot raised a hand gently. When one holds a sugar cube in tongs so prepared, the compound transfers invisibly. It leaves no warmth, no fingerprint. Only a delicate crystalline residue, which, as you know, was found upon the tongs themselves. Benton's composure thinned. "Residue can be placed anywhere," he said coolly. "Indeed," Poirot replied, "but not beneath the lining of your writing desk without intention." A silence fell, absolute and cutting. Poirot's voice did not rise. It became, if anything, softer. "On the afternoon of tea, you deviated from the established order. Instead of allowing Mrs. Penbury to serve in her customary sequence, you insisted, gallantly, that Miss Ashcombe be served first. You lifted the bowl, you held it, and in that moment you lifted 2 cubes for her cup." Margaret's breathing had grown very steady, as though she were listening to the recitation of something already known to her heart. "The substance transferred precisely as intended," Poirot continued, "invisible, tasteless at first, activated by heat." Dr. Mallory inclined his head slightly in confirmation. "You then returned the bowl," Poirot said, "and at some later moment, before suspicion crystallized, you excused yourself. You entered the study, you pocketed the tongs under pretense of examining their workmanship, or perhaps adjusting the tray. You concealed them beneath the lining of your desk." Benton's voice cut in sharply. "That is absurd." Poirot did not flinch. "You concealed them," he repeated calmly, "because their presence upon the tray would invite inspection once illness began. You anticipated alarm, you anticipated confusion, and confusion, you believed, would encourage swift agreement." He turned toward Margaret. "Miss Ashcombe's illness followed precisely as designed, sudden, distressing, yet non-fatal, enough to shake confidence, enough to suggest fragility, enough, perhaps, to imply that extended negotiations were imprudent." Mrs. Penbury pressed her hands together. Mr. Penbury's face had drained of color. Poirot faced Benton fully now. "You did not intend lasting harm," he said. "You intended leverage." Benton rose slowly. His agreeable manner had vanished. What remained was harder, sharper, a man accustomed to calculation and unused to being observed. "You construct a pleasing narrative, Mr. Poirot," he said coldly. "But narrative is not proof." Poirot inclined his head. "Proof resides in alignment," he said. "The residue on the tongs, the scratches upon the bowl, the compound in the uppermost cubes, the deviation from ritual, the concealment in your desk, each fact alone may be dismissed. Together, they form design." Benton's eyes flicked toward the door, then back. "You cannot demonstrate that I applied anything," he said. "No," Poirot agreed. "But I can demonstrate that no one else possessed both motive and composure. The servants lacked reason. Mr. Croydon lacked subtlety. Mr. Harcourt lacked foresight. Only you combined incentive, opportunity, and method." Margaret rose then, her voice clear. "You sought to frighten me," she said, "to make me doubt my strength, to rush my judgment." Benton met her gaze. For a moment, something almost like regret flickered, then vanished. "I sought efficiency," he said. "Busyness cannot wait upon sentiment." A quiet gasp escaped Mrs. Penbury. Poirot's expression hardened, not with anger, but with moral clarity. "Efficiency," he repeated softly. "You would introduce calculated illness into a lady's cup in the name of efficiency." Benton did not answer. "The illness," Poirot continued, "was meant to be a warning, a demonstration of vulnerability. You believed that panic would encourage swift agreement before further discomfort arose." Silence. Margaret's voice was calm, but edged with steel. "You misjudged me." "Yes," Poirot said gently. "He misjudged you." Benton's composure cracked then, not dramatically, but in a single brittle line. "You exaggerate," he said, though less firmly. "It was harmless." "Harmless," Poirot echoed quietly. "To tamper with trust, to manipulate health, to convert hospitality into strategy." Benton's jaw tightened. "It would have passed in a day," he muttered. "It has not passed," Poirot replied, "because character does not dissolve as quickly as sugar." The words hung, deliberate and final. Mr. Penbury stepped forward, his voice strained but resolute. "Our arrangement," he said, "is void. Benton's eyes flashed. "You cannot." "I can," Mr. Penbury said firmly. "And I will." Margaret did not look at Benton again. She turned instead toward the tea table, lifting the lid of the sugar bowl with measured calm. "2 cubes," she said quietly. "Always 2. Poirot watched her with thoughtful approval. "Their construction," he murmured, "is not merely the retelling of an act. It is the restoration of balance." Benton stood alone for a moment longer, then gathered himself with visible effort. "You have no legal proof," he said coldly. Poirot inclined his head. "Perhaps not," he replied. "But in matters of business, reputation is capital, and reputation, Mr. Benton, is now unsettled." The visitor's gaze lingered upon Margaret, then upon the desk in the study beyond the doorway. For the first time, uncertainty touched him. He turned and left without further word. The door closed. In the silence that followed, Mrs. Penbury sank into a chair. Mr. Penbury stood rigid, as though absorbing the collapse of illusion. Margaret remained upright. Poirot adjusted the sugar tongs delicately upon the tray. "The act," he said softly, "was designed to induce panic. Instead, it has induced clarity." He replaced the tongs beside the bowl, precisely aligned. "Sweetness," he added, "must never be forced." Chapter 9. The confrontation, the human spirit, I have noticed, is capable of bearing almost anything, provided it is not compelled to bear it in public. Private shame may be endured. Public exposure is another matter. Mr. Harold Benton, who had entered the Penbury household as one enters a well-lit room, confident that the light flatters him, had not yet understood that the same light reveals dust. Hercule Poirot understood it perfectly. And because he understood it, he did not seek drama. He sought arrangement. He asked that the household be assembled in the drawing room at 4 o'clock, precisely the hour at which the unfortunate tea had been taken. The request was framed politely, almost as though it concerned nothing more than concluding formalities. But there was no mistaking the tension that gathered as the hour approached. Mrs. Adela Penbury moved through her own house as though it had become unfamiliar. She touched the back of a chair, adjusted a curtain, straightened a book that required no straightening. Her eyes were bright with strain. Her devotion to civility fought with an instinct for self-protection. She wished for truth, but dreaded the disfigurement of her household's image. Mr. Penbury remained outwardly firm, yet his firmness had begun to resemble a rigid denial rather than strength. He had built a life upon business and order. To admit that business had invited poison to his tea table was to admit a failure of judgment he did not readily forgive. Margaret Ashcombe sat by the window. She wore a simple dress, and though her complexion remained pale, there was a steadiness in her posture that had not been present at the beginning. Illness had weakened her body, but it had hardened something else, something that refused to be managed. Mr. Graves stood near the doorway in his usual manner, quiet, upright, watchful. Ellen hovered behind him, fingers twisting at her apron. Dr. Mallory, invited by Poirot, sat in a chair slightly apart, as though wishing to distance himself from the moral implications of chemistry. Mr. Nathaniel Harcourt was present also. His face carried a weary discomfort. He had, in his misguided way, already been made to confront the ugliness of his own presumption. Now he watched the gathering with an expression that suggested a man observing a storm he once mistook for a passing cloud. And then Mr. Harold Benton arrived. He was punctual. He wore a dark suit, impeccably tailored, with a tie that was neither flamboyant nor modest. Precisely the sort of tie a man chooses when he wishes to be remembered as correct. His manner, on entering, was agreeable. He smiled, as though he had come to pay a routine call. "Mrs. Penbury, Mr. Penbury, Miss Ashcombe," he said, giving each their due in turn. His gaze touched Margaret with a particular calculation, polite, brief, and yet measuring. Then he saw Poirot. "Mr. Poirot," he said, "you appear to have taken up residence in this house." Poirot bowed slightly. "Only as long as disorder remains." Benton laughed softly. "Disorder is a strong word for a domestic inconvenience." Poirot did not answer the laughter. He gestured instead toward the tea table, which had been set with deliberate care. Upon it stood the silver set, restored to ceremonial perfection. The crystal sugar bowl sat at the center, its lid gleaming. Beside it lay the sugar tongs, placed upon a folded napkin as though upon a small altar. Benton's eyes flicked toward them. The movement was swift, so swift that a careless observer might have missed it. Poirot did not miss it. Margaret did not miss it either. I saw her gaze sharpen as though a familiar unease had returned. Poirot spoke gently. "Will you sit, Mr. Benton?" Benton sat. The household remained standing for a moment longer, then gradually took their places as well, though no one quite relaxed into a chair. Even seated, they appeared poised, like people awaiting a verdict. Poirot remained standing. He placed himself not behind the tea table, but beside it, so that the objects upon it were neither shield nor decoration, but evidence in plain sight. "My friends," he said quietly, "we are gathered to conclude. There has been too much confusion, too much half-confession and half-denial. The truth, once fractured, becomes dangerous. It must be restored whole." He turned to Benton. "Mr. Benton, you have been courteous enough to attend. I shall therefore be direct." Benton nodded. "Directness is appreciated." Poirot's eyes were calm. On the afternoon of the tea, Miss Ashcombe became suddenly ill. We have established the presence of a mild compound capable of causing distress without lasting harm. Dr. Mallory inclined his head faintly. Benton's smile remained. "If you say so," Poirot continued. "We have also established that the sugar tongs, an object central to the ceremony, disappeared during tea and were later discovered hidden beneath the lining of a writing desk in the study." At this, Benton's smile faltered slightly, then returned with effort. "The study is used by many," he said lightly. "A writing desk may conceal all sorts of forgotten objects." Poirot nodded, as though acknowledging a reasonable point. "Quite so," he said. "Therefore we must consider the residue." He reached to the tea table and lifted the tongs, not with bare fingers, but with a small cloth. The gesture was precise, almost reverent. He held them up so that the light from the window caught their inner grip. "Upon close examination," Poirot said, "a faint crystalline residue was discovered here. Unlike sugar, a chemist has confirmed its identity." Benton's eyes narrowed. "A chemist?" Poirot inclined his head toward Dr. Mallory. "The physician confirmed the effect, the chemist confirmed the substance. Together they confirm intention." Benton leaned back slightly. "You are creating an impressive little tribunal." Poirot's voice remained mild. "Not a tribunal, a reconstruction." Benton's gaze flicked to the door and back, as though measuring the possibility of departure, yet he did not rise. Poirot continued, "Mr. Benton, you have protested coincidence. You have protested ignorance. Let us consider what ignorance must explain." He moved one step closer to Benton, not threateningly, but with the quiet pressure of certainty. "First, why did you deviate from the customary order of serving?" Mrs. Penbury stiffened. The question struck her like an accusation against her own hospitality. Benton's eyes widened slightly, then he shrugged. "I did not deviate," he said smoothly. "I merely assisted. You make a great deal of etiquette." Poirot's head tilted slightly. "Etiquette is often the mask that protects the vulnerable. In this house, the host pours. The eldest guest receives. First, the sugar bowl passes in sequence. This ritual prevents any one person from controlling the flow." Benton's voice grew cooler. "I was being helpful." Mrs. Penbury looked preoccupied. Mrs. Penbury flushed, half with anger, half with humiliation. Poirot did not look at her. He looked only at Benton. "You insisted," Poirot said gently. "On serving Miss Ashcombe first." Margaret spoke then, her voice quiet but unwavering. "You did." Benton's gaze turned to her. "If I did, it was courtesy." Poirot nodded. "Courtesy." He let the word hang for a moment, then continued. "Second, why were the tongs in your desk?" Benton's composure tightened. He smiled again, but now the smile was thin. "I did not place them there," he said. "Anion could have done so, perhaps your ambitious young man. Croydon wished to shift suspicion." At the mention of Croydon's name, Mr. Penbury flinched slightly, as though reminded of earlier humiliation. Poirot's expression did not change. "Perhaps," he said mildly. "But then we must ask, why would Croydon choose to hide them beneath the lining of the desk most commonly used by you?" Benton's smile froze. "That desk is in Mr. Penbury's study," Benton said. "It is not mine." "It is used by you," Poirot replied. "You requested it. You sit at it. You keep your papers there. You have excused yourself during tea and entered the study alone." Benton's tone sharpened. "So have others." Poirot nodded. "So have others. But the desk belonged not to the servants, nor to Miss Ashcombe, nor to Mrs. Penbury. It was placed for you. You are, in practice, its owner." Benton's jaw tightened. "You are fond of practice." Poirot's eyes remained steady. "Practice is what creates the residue, Mr. Benton." A faint sound came from Ellen, something between a gasp and a swallowed sob. Mrs. Penbury turned her head sharply, as though to command the maid into silence. Poirot raised his hand slightly to still them all. "Let us be exact," he said. "We have the residue. We have the hidden placement. We have the deviation in serving, but there is more." He reached into his pocket and produced a folded document. "This," he said, "is the chemist's report." He handed it not to Benton, but to Mr. Penbury. Mr. Penbury unfolded it with fingers that trembled slightly, then read. His face hardened as he reached the conclusion. He looked up at Benton, and something in his expression changed, something colder than anger. Benton's composure held. "Barely. Chemists," Benton said dismissively. "They may find anything if they are paid to find it." Poirot's voice was soft. "You will find, Mr. Benton, that this chemist was not paid by the Penburys, nor by me. He was paid by a laboratory that values its reputation. Unlike some business arrangements, it does not profit from deception." Benton's eyes flashed. "You are insulting." Poirot inclined his head slightly. "I describe." Then Poirot did a thing I had seen him do only when he wished to shift the weight of a conversation from argument to inevitability. He turned away from Benton and addressed the room. "My friends, consider what is required to accomplish this act." He lifted the tongs again, holding them in such a way that the serrated tips were visible. "To apply a compound here, one requires composure. One must do it without trembling. One must do it with the confidence that no one will interrupt. One must have access." He gestured toward the study beyond the drawing room. "One must know that the cabinet is unlocked. One must understand the habits of the person one wishes to affect. Her preference for 2 cubes, her habit of taking from the top, her gentle stirring." His eyes moved to Margaret. "One must also have motive. Not romantic motive, not the crude desire to be admired, but the motive of profit, of negotiation, of removing an obstacle." Mr. Harcourt's face tightened as though stung by the distinction. Poirot turned back toward Benton. "And when the act is complete," he continued, "one must conceal the instrument, not by throwing it away, too obvious, not by returning it immediately, too risky, but by hiding it where one may retrieve it later, beneath the lining of one's own desk." Benton's voice cut in sharply. "You have no witness who saw me do any of this?" Poirot nodded. "No single witness. That is why you believed you were safe." He paused, then continued very quietly. "But you forgot that ritual creates witnesses without intention. A maid sees a hand reach too often. A butler notices a lining raised by a fraction. A sister remembers a deviation in order. And chemistry. Chemistry remembers what men try to forget." Benton rose abruptly. "I will not remain here to be accused," he snapped. "This is all inference and theatre." Poirot did not move to stop him. He merely watched with calm attention. Benton took one step toward the door, then he stopped. Poirot said softly, without raising his voice, "If you leave now, Mr. Benton, you leave not as an innocent man offended, but as a guilty man escaping." Benton's shoulders stiffened. He turned slowly back. "You are playing with language," he said, his voice low. "You cannot prove I intended harm." Poirot's gaze was steady. "Then explain the residue." Benton's lips parted, then closed. Explain the tongs beneath your desk, Poirot continued. Benton's eyes flicked toward the study, then away. Explain why you served Miss Ashcombe first, Poirot said. Benton's jaw worked as though he chewed upon the words, but he did not speak. In that silence, I felt a shift in the room, like a curtain drawn back. Denial may be loud, guilt, when cornered, is often quiet. Margaret rose then, slowly, with a kind of controlled dignity that seemed to straighten the very air. I do not require further explanation, she said. Mr. Penbury turned toward her sharply. Margaret, she lifted a hand, not harshly, but decisively. Number, I have spent too long believing that reason alone would protect me. I see now that reason invites challenges. Her eyes rested on Benton with a calm contempt that did not need words. I withdraw, she said. From the arrangement, from the negotiation, from any discussion that assumes my signature may be obtained by pressure. Benton's face tightened. You cannot simply— I can, Margaret replied quietly. Because I am no longer persuading anyone, I am deciding. Poirot watched her with something like approval. Mrs. Penbury's voice trembled. Margaret, you are certain? Margaret turned toward her sister, and the hard edge softened slightly. I am certain, she said, and I am sorry that certainty has cost us peace. Mr. Penbury drew a deep breath. He looked at Benton with a steadiness he had not shown before. Our agreement, he said, is terminated. You will leave this house, and you will not return. Benton's composure shattered, not into confession, but into a brittle fury. You think you are righteous, he said sharply. You think you are protected by this little detective. You will regret this. Poirot's voice was very quiet. Threats are the last refuge of the man whose calculations have failed. Benton stared at him, then at the tongs on the tea table, as though the slim silver instrument mocked him. For a moment, he looked as if he might seize it, bend it, destroy it, some childish gesture to reclaim power through damage. But he did not. He only stood very still, breathing shallowly. Then, with a visible effort, he gathered himself again. The mask returned, cracked but worn. This is not finished, he said coldly. Poirot inclined his head. On the contrary, Mr. Benton, it is finished. You brought the disturbance here. You have been disturbed. Benton turned and left. The door closed behind him with a sound that was not loud, yet felt final. For a moment no one moved. Then Mrs. Penbury sank into her chair as though her bones had grown suddenly heavy. Ellen began to cry quietly, muffling it with her apron. Mr. Graves remained rigid, but his eyes held something like relief. Mr. Harcourt stared at the carpet, his mouth drawn tight. Whatever illusions he had once held about protecting Margaret had been stripped away. He saw now what protection looks like when it is corrupted. It resembles control. Margaret remained standing. She looked not triumphant, but weary. Poirot stepped toward the tea table and, with careful gentleness, placed the tongs back beside the sugar bowl, aligning them exactly. Motive and means, he said softly, have clasped hands like conspirators. But conspirators do not thrive under light. Mr. Penbury spoke, his voice hoarse. Will there be consequences? Poirot's eyes were grave. There will be consequences of business, certainly, and perhaps of law, if you choose to pursue it. But the deeper consequence is this: trust has been harmed, and trust is not so easily restored as silver. Margaret's voice was low. I will not stay in this house much longer. Mrs. Penbury looked up sharply. Margaret. Margaret's expression softened, but did not yield. I love you, Adela, she said, but I will not be surrounded by those who believe they may decide for me. I will recover fully elsewhere, where tea is taken for comfort, not as an arena. Poirot watched her thoughtfully. Madam, he said, you have been ill, but you have not been weakened in the part that matters. Margaret met his gaze. And you, Mr. Poirot, she said quietly, you saw the truth in the smallest object. Poirot's mouth tightened slightly, not in pride, but in that familiar seriousness of his. A small object, he replied, often contains the whole drama. A sugar cube dissolves, but the choice to contaminate it does not dissolve. It remains in the mind of the one who did it and in the memory of those who endured it. He glanced once more at the tea set, restored, gleaming, obedient. The ceremony, he added softly, will continue, but now you will see what ceremony cannot hide. Thus the confrontation ended, not with a shout, nor a confession, nor the satisfaction of handcuffs, but with something perhaps more decisive, exposure. And in that exposure, the household's polished order, once used as camouflage, became instead a mirror in which each person saw his own reflection, clear, sharp, and impossible to sweeten. Chapter 10. The return of small things in the days that followed. Quiet return to the Penbury household. Not the complacent quiet of unquestioned order, but a quieter, more deliberate stillness. It was the stillness that comes after illusion has been removed, when objects appear unchanged, yet the eyes that regard them have altered. The sugar tongs were restored to their velvet cradle within the glass-fronted cabinet. Mr. Graves polished them once again, not merely with diligence, but with a solemnity that suggested restoration rather than maintenance. When he replaced them beside the teapot and bowl, he paused for a fraction of a moment longer than necessary, as though acknowledging that even silver, once misused, requires a kind of pardon. They gleamed as before, their slim arms curved with familiar elegance. The serrated tips shone without blemish. To a casual observer, nothing in their appearance betrayed the role they had played. Silver remembers. It reflects not only light but intent. It carries in its smooth surfaces the memory of hands that have held it and purposes it has served. In this affair, it was not a jewel, nor a document, nor a weapon that carried malice. It was a utensil dismissed as trivial, an object so small that its absence had first been regarded as mere irritation. Hercule Poirot stood once more before the cabinet on the afternoon of his departure. Mrs. Penbury accompanied him, her expression composed but thoughtful. "You have given us back our order," she said quietly. Poirot inclined his head. "Madam, I have given you clarity. Order must now be chosen." She regarded the silver through the glass. "I once believed that ritual protected us." "It does," Poirot replied gently, "but only when it is sincere. When ritual becomes performance, it may conceal betrayal rather than prevent it." Mrs. Penbury absorbed this without protest. The experience had altered her, not into suspicion, but into awareness. Margaret Ashcombe joined them. Her color had returned, and though she still moved with measured care, there was strength in her step. She had resolved to spend some months away from London at a small property she owned in the countryside. The decision had not been made in haste, it had been made in clarity. "I owe you thanks," she said to Poirot. "You owe me nothing," he replied. "You owe yourself confidence." She smiled faintly. "Confidence I had, I lacked caution." Poirot shook his head slightly. "Number you lacked treachery. It is not a flaw." She looked at the tongs through the cabinet glass. "I shall never again regard them as insignificant," she said. "Nor should you," Poirot answered. "Small tools carry large intentions. The smallest instrument may reveal the grandest design." Mr. Penbury entered then, carrying a letter in his hand. His manner was grave, but steadier than before. "Benton has written," he said. Mrs. Penbury stiffened slightly. "He denies everything, of course," Mr. Penbury continued, "but he has withdrawn from all negotiations, quietly." Poirot nodded. "Reputation is a delicate commodity. There will be whispers," Mr. Penbury said. "There are always whispers," Poirot replied. "What matters is whether they are deserved." Mr. Penbury met his gaze and did not look away. "In this case, they are." Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Mr. Harcourt had already called to express his regret once more, his voice subdued. He had learned that affection, when expressed through manipulation, becomes indistinguishable from ambition. His visits would continue, but with less presumption and more humility. As for Edwin Croydon, his brief intrigue had collapsed under the weight of a larger design. He had left the firm, his lesson, though different in scale, had been no less severe. Ambition without restraint is easily used by those with colder aims. And so the household adjusted, not by abandoning ceremony, but by understanding it. On Poirot's final afternoon, Mrs. Penbury insisted upon serving tea once more. This time, the ritual unfolded exactly as it should. The host poured. The eldest guest, Mr. Harcourt, received first. The bowl was passed in sequence. When it reached Margaret, she lifted the tongs herself. 2 cubes, always 2. She held them for a moment above her cup, then allowed them to fall. They struck the porcelain with a soft sound, clear, honest. She stirred lightly, just as before. Poirot watched, not with suspicion, but with a measured satisfaction. "You see," he said quietly to me as we observed, "the path of sugar, from bowl to tong to cup, revealed a design as precise as the instrument itself. The object was small, the intention was not." I asked him whether he considered the matter fully resolved. He adjusted his gloves with characteristic neatness before answering. "In the legal sense, perhaps not," he said. "But in the moral sense, yes, the design has been exposed, and exposure is often the only justice available when harm is subtle." He glanced once more at the tea table, at the silver set resting in dignified composure. "One must never underestimate the trivial," he added. "A missing utensil, a deviation in order, a hand that reaches too soon. These are the tremors that precede revelation." Mrs. Penbury approached then, offering him his cup. "No sugar, Mr. Poirot?" she asked gently. He smiled faintly. "1 cube," he said. "Today, 1 will suffice." She lifted the tongs carefully, deliberately, and placed a single cube into his cup. The gesture was unhurried, transparent, unshadowed by calculation. Poirot inclined his head in thanks. As we departed the house, the square lay quiet beneath a pale sky. Curtains stirred faintly behind windows. A carriage passed at measured speed. Nothing in the outward world suggested the drama that had unfolded over sugar and silver. Yet within that polished house, a lesson remained. Ritual may conceal betrayal, courtesy may disguise ambition, and the smallest instrument, dismissed as trivial, may carry the weight of intention. Thus ended the mystery of the missing sugar tongs, a trifle no longer.